What is the ultimate self? 12.1. Prajapati told him, this body, subject to birth and death, is claimed by death, but the eternal, bodiless self is its foundation. This means that the body, which undergoes birth and death, is just a base. Upon this foundation rests an eternal, immortal self, formless and unconfined by a material body. 12.4 further elaborates on the activities of this self. When we think I am seeing, who is doing the seeing? It is this self that sees. When we think I am smelling, who is doing the smelling? It is this self that smells. Therefore, this self is not inert or inactive. It is the source of all cognitive activities, the true essence hidden behind the scenes. Having eliminated all the previous misunderstandings and superficial misinterpretations of the self, we finally arrive at the true, deeply hidden ātman. Here, subject and object are no longer opposed, duality dissolves, and Brahman and the self become one, the state of unity of heaven and humanity that our ancestors spoke of. This ātman is truly remarkable. As you can see in 12.6, all gods worship this ātman. Once you have found this ātman, you surpass all the realms of gods. Moreover, with this ātman, all worlds belong to you, and all desires are fulfilled. Let's summarize the key characteristics of this ultimate self, as sought by the Brahmanical tradition. First, this self must be the ultimate reality. It must exist. And what is the characteristic of its existence? It is eternal and unchanging, immortal and indestructible. It cannot undergo any transformation or be subject to birth and death. Second, this self must be the subject of life, the root cause, the ultimate controller, the agent of all actions, and the experiencer of all cognitions. It cannot be inert, unknowing, or passive. It must be active and responsible for all activities. It sustains and governs all things. Now, let's consider this question. Why did these Brahmanical sages, these great philosophers who recorded the Upanishads, relentlessly seek such a self? Why couldn't they stop at the material body and declare, the body is the self? Why couldn't they be content with the idea of a wandering consciousness as the self, or even the absolutely still, absolutely pure self in dreamless sleep? Why were these not considered worthy of being the self? In our daily lives, we constantly use the terms you, I, and he, she. We seem to have a clear understanding of what constitutes me, you, and others. Why then did these Brahmanas set such a high standard for the self? Why did it have to be eternal, and changing, unaffected by the fluctuations of matter and consciousness, and capable of governing both the material and mental realms? Why establish such a high bar? Upon reflection, we realize that while we may think we understand what I am, human life is full of change. Each of us starts from a single cell, a fertilized egg, and transforms into a complex being, undergoing immense physical and mental changes. Yet, don't we still believe that despite all these changes, there's something unchanging that persists throughout? That unchanging element is the I. Although I've transformed from a single cell into countless cells, with every molecule and atom shifting positions, it's still the same I who was conceived, born, grew up, and will eventually die. Amidst all the changes, there's something unchanging. Isn't that how we think? This unchanging element is the most crucial factor, the very basis for distinguishing between you, I, and others. As the comedian Yu Yunpeng puts it, we always feel that there's this thing that is me. In English, it's called identity. Identity implies both sameness and individuality. So, this unchanging element represents a continuity of being. Every cognition, every thought, every action we undertake is permeated by this sense of continuity. For example, when I had breakfast this morning and walked to the venue, I felt that it was I who ate breakfast and I who arrived here. Although the circumstances changed, I remain the same. The I who departed and the I who arrived are one and the same. What is this I? In our thought structure, it is the subject. And what is the subject? It is the agent that initiates and carries out actions. Without a subject, how can actions like eating and walking occur? How can we describe, think about, or understand them? It's impossible. Can you imagine an action without an actor, a deed without a do? It's inconceivable. Therefore, the search for an eternal and changing subject, a persistent self, stems from our need to find a fundamental ground for our actions and experiences. But why does the impermanent, ever-changing world of phenomena require such a ground? Why can't it exist without it? It's because our mode of thinking demands it. To understand anything, we first need to assign it a unique identity. Whose action is this? What is the essence of this phenomenon? Only after making such an identification can we begin to understand. We label something, and then we can say these are its attributes, its manifestations, its actions, its behaviors, its influences, and so on. Only then can our minds process it. Think about it. If our initial identification is wrong, if the uniqueness and continuity we assign have no corresponding reality, then our labeling is flawed. Consequently, all knowledge based on this flawed identification becomes invalid. The Upanishads, with their layers of inquiry and reflection, are essentially analyzing our modes of perception and cognitive structures. If our experiences of living, eating, walking, attending meetings, giving presentations, and listening to lectures are not entirely illusory, if they have any basis in reality, then there must be something an eternal and changing self that underpins them. Whether this self is individual or collective is a separate discussion, but there has to be some foundation, some starting point. Only with this self can we speak of it governing change and possessing infinite potential. Only with this ground can we make sense of the world and engage in thought. Don't you think this is the underlying structure of our thinking? This is the line of reasoning employed by the Brahmanical tradition in India. In fact, ancient Greek ontology follows a similar path. Even someone who has never studied philosophy or engaged in philosophical reflection still thinks this way when they eat, walk, or go about their day. It's our shared cognitive bias. The only difference is that most people never reflect on it. They're unaware of this underlying assumption. Philosophers, however, bring this mode of thinking to light. This is why the Upanishads and ancient Greek ontology are so insightful. They reveal the fundamental principles of human thought. However, their analyses share a preconceived notion that these fundamental principles of human thought are correct, or at least fundamentally correct and consistent with reality. They assume that there must exist something in the world that corresponds to our identification of the self. This something must exist. It's just that we haven't found it yet. It's our job to keep searching. Buddhism, emerging centuries later, directly challenges this fundamental presupposition of human thought. It asserts that this presupposition is false, that such a thing simply cannot be found in the world. Before we delve into Buddhist thought, let's consider one more question. We've discussed how the Brahmanical tradition progressively seeks an ultimate self. Now, let's assume, hypothetically, that even the Brahmanas, after their exhaustive search, fail to find this fourth level of self. What then happens to the first three levels of the physical, mental, and phenomenal selves? Would they still hold? This is a crucial question, and we'll keep revisiting it today. In my view, the Brahmanical concept of ātman or Brahman serves as the foundation and ultimate support for the first three levels of self, the physical, mental, and phenomenal. Without this ultimate ground, the previous levels cannot exist. As we discussed earlier, Can we even imagine an action without an actor, a behavior without an agent? It's impossible. Therefore, if there were no self, and our actions, bodies, and consciousness could still function perfectly, there would be no need to seek this self. It would be a pointless exercise, wouldn't it? So, even from the perspective of those who believe in the existence of the self, without this self, there would be nothing for it to support or sustain. Let's remember this conclusion as we move forward. If we were to use a single term to encompass the physical, mental, and phenomenal aspects of life, we could call it the person. Now, how do we answer the question posed earlier? We could say that the person implies the existence of a self. Conversely, the Brahmanical tradition asserts the existence of the self. But if we were to ask them, what if there were no self, they would likely respond, then there would be no person. Therefore, there must be a self, otherwise, nothing would make sense. The person necessitates the existence of a self. Without the self, there is no person.